inspiring talk. Now we are opening the floor to questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand and write it down on a piece of paper that looks like this. One of our volunteers will be happy to collect them. Jeremy can collect them and also issue you a piece of paper if you'd like to ask a question.
Can I make one comment?
Sure.
Before you? I said when I wrote the announcement that after, bring your favorite poem and we will read it in discussion. Now, if you brought a favorite poem, I mean, after the question and answer, we usually sit in a circle and have a discussion. That's when you can share your favorite poem and tell me why it's your favorite poem. Okay? Now we'll do the question and answer.
Okay, great. We'll start out with a little background. What made you move to Korea? Did you move with your family or on your own? Give us a little personal and decision to move to Korea. What year?
What year?
Sure.
Well, the first time I came to Korea, it was 1981. And I lived here, yes. And I lived here until 1984. At that time, I was the 회의 창문 소빙 교수, right? The visiting professor at the English department at Chonnam National University, and so for 3 years I taught conversation, one semester, composition the next semester, all the sophomore English majors. And it's at that time that I first met Professor Shin. He was a professor in the department. I was a visiting instructor. And at that time I did get to teach one class in poetry, modern American poetry, very kind. And so I went back in 1984, I went back to the University of Wisconsin. I got a Ph.D. in American poetry, in literature. I taught for 20 years in the United States. In 2009, I came back to, oh, I forgot to say, in 1982, I married a woman from Gwangju. I forgot that. And I forgot that part too. And in 2009, I came back to Chonbuk National University on a Fulbright. At that time, I was reintroduced to my old friends from the English department here. And they invited me to come back. So I quit my job in America, and our children were grown up. They had moved out of the house. We had an empty nest. I quit my job in America, sold my house, and we moved back to Korea in 2010, and I've been here ever since as one of the international friends.
Now, Robert is the first department chair from abroad in Chonnam National. You are the first department chair.
Yeah. Well, there are only like 11 or 12.
International.
I mean, there are lots of international
His
teachers.
class is amazing.
Yeah, look at that. Yeah, I love that. Okay, I said
I guarantee.
I said you wouldn't get extra credit for coming, but I'm going to give you some. Are you looking for? No, I'm not good. But thank you for coming. Thank you for staying.
Okay, great. So it's awesome to see a lot of your students here. What would you say are your students' typical reactions to learning about poetry, for example, American poetry?
Turn this back on. I'll show you. Well, here, students absorb the PPT. Please, thank you. Here, students absorb what I'm saying a little bit more. Korean students are much better listeners than American students. I try to work through things a little bit more carefully with Korean students than I do because English is their second language. But I think people usually like the poetry, and if they don't like the poetry, as you can tell, and can be occasionally silly, I think they enjoy the class. But judging by their exams, the students learn pretty well. Not all of them, but you know, they're students. Oh, here, I'm going to tell you this. I'm going to use a story because I taught a lot in America. America, when students go to high school, they hear this. They hear this all the time. They say, "A poem can mean anything you want it to mean." It's because their high school teachers have no idea how to read poetry. They're just terrible. They're bad at it, and so they come to college and they say, "Well, my high school teacher told me a poem can mean whatever I want it to mean." And I said, that was good for her, but not for me. Because, you know, poems are made out of words. But you see, American students do not absorb as well as Korean students. They're always they think, well, my opinion is good as anybody's opinion. And your opinion is okay, but you know, I've been studying this stuff for 20 years, so please don't insult me. And Korean students understand that. Oh, he's in front of the classroom because he knows something about the topic. Because they assume that. American students don't ever assume that. In math, they believe it. In English, they never believe it. Some of them. And so I had a student once, this is my story about how students, some don't like me. She wrote a poem on a paper on this poem, and I gave her a fairly low grade. And she said, your opinion isn't any better than mine. I don't understand how you give me a low grade. My opinion is as good as your opinion. I said, okay, bring the paper to my office. Let's talk about it. So we looked at it. I love this one. We read the first line. I said, okay, flesh is heretic. What do you think about that line? And she looked at it. I said, well, you know, we know what these words, what does this word mean? And she said, I don't know. I said, get out. It's made out of words. Words have meanings. Every word has, now a poem could have multiple meanings. You can argue over the interpretation, but it cannot mean whatever you want. But I think she got the idea, is that, no, you can't argue your opinion unless you know what the words mean, and at least Koreans are more interested in knowing what the word means. I'm going to stop on
Okay, great.
She transferred by the different college, where people understood her genius.
Okay, this next question from the audience kind of touches on what you just talked about. Every person has a different perspective, and every poem can be interpreted in different ways.
Certainly.
I guess I apologize if I'm not relaying this correctly, but I think why or how can they figure out what is a good poem, what is not a good poem?
There was my question.
Oh,
okay.
Yes. Every single human being has different perspective, and so
Right.
every single poem can be interpreted different ways, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So how do we then, as a student, I'm an English major, and I have to learn poem, right?
No, you do.
Why do we learn poem? I mean, it can be, you know, it can be discussion-like classes, but we do learn poem.
Yeah, I lecture.
Right, and
Because-
we're judged by exams, right? As
Right.
people.
Right,
And
right.
Why should we do that like that?
Why do you do it that way?
If
Yeah.
that is why we have to find out what poems are the good poems. Then what are the good poems from your perspective?
How do you, a good poem, I hate to find this question, is one that uses language in complex and artful ways.
Okay.
That does not use, does not depend on cliched language. Helps us see something new. But sometimes I don't believe this definition. It depends on what kind of poem you're reading. I will tell you in our class, we're reading things that are historically important
Okay, wait.
and have been assumed to be. And I hope to show you why they are good and complex poems. And for you to judge, how do you judge a good poem? People argue about this all the time. I used to have a colleague in America who hated the poetry that I loved. And we both, she loved Robert Frost, and I like him okay, but he's not my favorite poet. And we would have arguments about, and we were both well educated in poetry, so there is no single answer. But what you do need to do, I think, is you need to study poetry and study different kinds of poetry and say, okay, how is this one considered to be a good poem? How is this one considered to be a poem? Why does he say it's a good poem? And then from there you start to develop your own individual standards. Because yes, any poem, this is my whole, any good poem has multiple interpretations. I showed you the one from W.B. Yeats, body swayed to music, oh brightening glance, how can we tell the dancer from the dance? My mentor, an older gentleman at the college where I taught in the United States, he said, I have been reading that poem for 30 years, and I find something new in it every time. Because it's an amazing, complicated poem. But, and so his own judgment of why it's a good poem changed. But you have to develop your own standards for good poetry. In my class, you don't have to tell me it's a good poem. You have to tell me the complicated things that are happening to it that I showed you You got to tell me you understood what's going on in the poem, according to what I suggested. And we don't do discussion much in Korean classes because I haven't figured a way to. I love to hear myself talk. What am I saying? That's why we don't do discussion. I like to talk. Okay, yeah, but after class. Okay,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, it's
I told you I
perfect.
like to talk.
No, you're good at it. So you've mentioned a couple times that you're not a big fan of Frost, Robert Frost. Can you tell us who your favorite poet is?
No, I can't.
You cannot.
No, I cannot. That's my favorite poet. Let me see. Okay, Emily Dickinson. I'll say that. There's one. On every day that varies. I do not have a favorite. But Emily Dickinson uses language in such a powerful and condensed way. Those two, we read one 6-line poem and one 4-line poem. If I start to write about those poems, I can probably write just describing what happens in the poem. I could probably go on for 6 to 8 pages about each one of those poems, and maybe longer. And that's what and so that's why I like her, is that complex use of language, but also because she's a poet that, not just the complex use of language was really powerful, but because she shares some of the themes. She's constantly questioning what it means to be a person of faith, for instance, and sometimes to the point where she doesn't believe. I shouldn't admit this with Mr. Cho. I'm a churchgoer, and I identify with, but I'm not always sure, right? And so I identify with that aspect of Emily Dickinson as well, this constant questioning and hope to find something, a true answer. But mostly it's because she's a really good poet. It's condensed and powerful use of language for me.
Great. We have time for a couple more questions. You mentioned how you think poetry is very important on many different levels. Do you notice rises or declines in its production? Do you imagine there will ever be a world without new poetry being developed?
No. No. And I'll say, will there ever be a world without new poetry being developed? I think one of the places it develops is through music. This is where it started, right? Used to be traveling poets. They'd go around, or singers. This is where poets with their lyres or little guitar-like instruments. And a lot of good poetry comes out of music. Bob Dylan, famous American poet, he studied in English departments all the time. Hip-hop music starts out as a right, hip-hop rhythm starts out as a play with language, with kids sitting on the street corner. No, language, people are always in love with language. They're always going to do new things with language. Always create new things with language, I think. And there's always a lot of production of poetry. There are lots of writers of poetry these days. Lots of journalists.
Okay, great. I think maybe we'll wrap it up with this last question. Could you, by chance, read us a poem you wrote?
No. Thank you for asking. No, I couldn't, because I don't think I've written a poem in 20. I'll tell you about. Of course, as a young man, I wanted to be a poet. And then I became an English major. I started reading these really wonderful poets, and I said, I can't do that, so I quit. Because this is honestly, this is true. Well, I didn't quit completely, but in the world, there are all kinds of things. I love to play basketball. I'm a terrible basketball player, but I played for years. Well, not terrible, but not. I'm never the first choice when we split up. But I'm in the bottom. But I kept playing. I didn't care. I liked to play basketball, right? So I played. I didn't care if I was bad. They could make fun of me. Screw you. I don't care. I'll knock you down when you're in basketball. But I did do that. That didn't matter. In basketball, baseball, I kept softball. It didn't matter. Anything, even teaching. I'm not that good of a teacher. I don't care. But poetry, writing poetry, that's the one thing. If I couldn't be the Willie Mays of poetry, I wasn't going to do it. And so I can't read you one of my poems because I haven't written one in years. That's all.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. Okay.